Welcome to Theology for the Unwanted Podcast. I'm Dan Tilson, your Catholic guru, and I've got my co-host over here, John Byram.
How's it going?
All right, episode 1.
Let's do it.
John, I've been wanting to do this for many, many years now. As you know, I've worked with a lot of Catholics who have felt that they've had a rough time growing up in the Catholic Church. Maybe something in their background, whether they're divorced and remarried, or maybe they just couldn't find a way to fit into their parish community. I've worked with now more than 225 Catholics like that. And I've got to say, for a lot of folks, I have learned how theology can help us bridge the gap. Theology can not only show us why our personal stories matter, but also how we help make the church more holy. So, John, you're one of my longest running friends at this point.
Ooh.
How did we meet?
I feel like I should get a trophy for that or something. No, we met all the way back in college. I believe the year was 1843 at George Mason University. And that was during a very interesting time period in my life. I was actually in the process of converting. Yes, a college convert. Whoever heard that, to the Catholic faith. And that's how I ran into you, Dan, at the chapel on campus. And then, yeah, it was kind of a history from there.
It actually took me a while to realize that you were not a full member of the Catholic Church. I mean, you seemed like you were fully a part of the Catholic bubble, just as I was. I saw you at all of the sporting events. In fact, that's how I knew you. You were the sports guy.
We went to CCM had a massive presence at Mason basketball games, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I was there doing intramurals with CCM. Pretty much doing everything I could. It was a very interesting time period in my life, reading as much as I could about the Catholic Church, trying to immerse myself a little bit more, going through RCIA, and then also trying to meet as many people as I could to try to find those people I could ask those hard questions to.
Now, you had a nickname for me back when we were in college. Do you remember what it was?
Oh, it was like Liturgic Geek or something like that?
Yeah. I grew up going to the Latin Mass at my local parish, and you know what? It was actually a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed it, and it was a Novus Ordo too. Pope Benedict had not quite allowed the traditional Latin Mass yet, and so that was something that I really only briefly attended before going to college. But I had that foundation and really learned to love the liturgy. I also grew up campaigning. I loved working on conservative campaigns all over the area. And these are things, along with my church experiences, that have really formed me. At the same time, I also had a sense when I was younger that I was a little bit different. But I was very, very focused on defending the church. And that was really important to me.
So, Dan, you have a lot of experience. You have a wealth of knowledge with a lot of these topics that we're going to be covering on this podcast. But first, I want to ask you, what made you want to start this ministry?
Probably because even for all of the difficult experiences and the things that I was really kind of shoving deep down as a kid, I was also having a great time being Catholic. I had enough really good experiences to offset that. Of course, when we were in college, I did that internship for the Vatican's embassy in Switzerland. I've gone on to write for the Holy See for the past 5 years on Western Hemisphere issues. So I've been really lucky to stay close to the church itself. When the synod came up in 2021, I was actually charged with conducting the survey at my parish. We were asking all the parishioners, do you like attending Mass? What could we do different? What do you get out of the Mass? What do you believe? And we actually found that about 80% of the parishioners were having a fantastic time. However, 20% were not. And a lot of those parishioners were actually thinking back to memories that they had as a kid, as cradle Catholics. And so I started to sit down and say, tell me your story. I want to listen. And the more people that I would listen to, the more people would raise their hand and say, I have a friend that needs to talk to you. And so very quickly, my project went way past the parish boundaries. And at this point, I've now met with more than 225 Catholics. So at the end of the day, I want to help people love being Catholic. I want to help people find a way to stay being Catholic. But I also understand that's not an option for a lot of people. And in that case, I really hope that our listeners are able to get a little bit of healing from listening to this podcast.
Yeah, so it sounds like you have a dedicated approach that you want to take with this ministry. What is that approach? How are we going to talk about these topics and really try to help people?
Well, the good news is that Catholic theology, of course, Catholic means universal, right? So the theology is able to speak in a universal way, no matter what it is that you're experiencing, no matter what the reason is that you feel like you did not belong in your parish. Catholic theology can speak to you in a very concrete way. And so that's what we're looking for. We're drawing from our experiences, both of us here. We're trying to show the listeners how they can listen to their own story and to the stories of others around them. And then we're going to try and find ways to help make the church more holy, to make that space for folks so that we can address whatever it is that we have to address, but we can find a way to be a unified and universal church.
That sounds like a great idea. Have you ever thought about like writing a book or something?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. There's a special announcement coming probably in the next few months, but we'll hold that secret for now.
Okay, Dan, let's go and jump into our first topic. And I'm going to do that with a question for you.
Shoot.
Why are you Catholic?
And there's really only one answer you can give to that. You are Catholic because you are searching for the truth.
Okay, but why are you still Catholic?
Huh. That's a good question. I mean, considering all that I had experienced when I was younger and the process of unpacking that, I mean, the fact that I had bad experiences, to me, that doesn't negate the fact that I'm searching for the truth. And I do believe that the Catholic Church has the truth. But the reason for this podcast is something just ever so slightly different. It's trying to recognize the voices out there, the things that people try to impose on us that make us biased against ourselves, against others. Truth right now, I would say, is really being distorted by polarization. Have you noticed that Catholic Twitter is hyper polarized right now?
I would say Twitter in general is hyper polarized, but yes, Catholic Twitter is pretty polarized.
It's good to know that we're not going through it alone. But that's the deal, which is the new theological landscape. It really is that loneliness. And this is something you're going to hear us go in more depth in future episodes. But there have been many different issues facing the Catholic Church over the centuries. And the issue that we are facing right now is loneliness. It is isolation. And these are things that if we want the Catholic Church to really thrive in the modern world, we are going to have to figure out, how do you take the truth and present it in a way where individuals are not being separated into tribes? Because the second that we divide ourselves into tribes, we are no longer a universal truth.
So kind of like the divisions we see in American politics.
And, I was definitely a part of that once upon a time. I'm actually still proudly very conservative, but I was looking back at my Facebook memories recently, and that's a dangerous thing to do.
Very dangerous.
Yeah, well, here we are. But I was glad to see that even in college, even in high school, as I was towing the line of the person I was campaigning for, I was still saying like, hey, we can't just discard people. And that's actually something that the Catholic Church has been doing much better on over the past 10, 15 years or so. We've been realizing that, yes, we have truth. Now, what do we do with it? So, one of the questions I'm posing today is, what makes this so difficult? And I don't know that we're going to have an answer to this, but I do want to go to that story of Emmaus. Do you remember when we were going on college retreats and did the Emmaus walk?
Everyone looked forward to the Emmaus walk.
Why do you look forward to it?
Because, you got a chance to kind of just talk about things, talk about what's going on in your life and like your struggles and your journey within the church as well. And just kind of not just have someone to bounce ideas off of, but, it's important to have those conversations.
Yeah, so for any of our listeners that may not be familiar, an Emmaus walk is when you're on retreat, usually you're away from your college campus for the weekend, and you get paired up with somebody, and you just walk through nature and talk about whatever it is that's on your heart. Now, I would venture to say that most people hope that they could get paired up with their crush.
Yes, there was some politics in the Emmaus walks where they're kind of jockeying for position to get closer to the front of the line if they knew they're going to get paired with someone. But honestly, like when you take a look at it, when you're in college, you're still learning a lot about yourself too. You're sort of learning about a lot of your faith journey as well. So you kind of want to have that conversation with someone that you may trust a little bit more than maybe that one creepy guy that was in the group or whatever, or that one person that maybe you just didn't feel comfortable talking to. So yeah, so there was some jockeying of position, if you will.
That's exactly it. I mean, everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be understood by somebody. And in the digital age, particularly once you graduate from college, you go out into the world, you're thrust into this competition at work, at home. Maybe you're no longer the youngest kid at Thanksgiving, but the world can be very tough, especially once you are out of school and you're on your own. The world can be very, very tough. And so there's this challenge we have in recognizing our own dignity. And that's something that Jesus really tried to impart on his disciples when he was walking with them at Emmaus. Now, it is worth mentioning, I've gone to an Italian church the past 17 years, and it was only recently that I learned that this word is not pronounced a mouse.
Did you really? You thought it was a mouse?
A mouse.
Even though every single time in college when we went off to a retreat and we called it the Emmaus walk, were you correcting people, telling people it was a mouse?
I'm not going to lie, I probably was, because back then I was really fixated on that identity of being a liturgy geek. And in Italian and in the very traditional communities, particularly when you are abroad, they have no idea where we got this extra syllable from. This is an American invention, as one would say.
That's fair. It's kind of right up there with like General Tso's chicken. It's not really Chinese food. It's an American invention. Well,
that is a terrifying thing to learn. But the reality is that all of us want to be seen. And sometimes when we're trying to pursue the truth, we're trying to live out the truth, we'll take aspects of our own identity and we will really, really accentuate it. Now, I know for me, growing up, I had really struggled with my sexuality. Of course, going to a conservative, traditional parish that I loved, I obviously wanted my priests to love me back. I wanted my family and my community to be very proud of me. And what happens when you're trying to compete for that attention? It is only human nature to try and take your secrets or things that you feel like you might be judged for and to put them under your feet and to stomp on them. But that is one of the things that makes it difficult to recognize Jesus, because we are taking aspects of our own identity and tossing them away. And so for this, there's some theologians that I have been relying on in my own formation that I wanted to share with folks. And one of them is Maurizio Chiodi. He talks a lot. He's at the Pontifical Academy for Life, by the way. And it's interesting to note that the Academy for Life doesn't just do pro-life issues at the Vatican. They're talking about anything that has to do with how humankind, how men interact with one another socially, how we form these bonds, how we essentially learn to treat one another with human dignity. And what he says is that fundamental life experiences form the basis of our morality. So if we're pursuing truth, there's no way that we can expect to see Jesus, to understand that he is revealing himself to us if we're taking parts of our identity and we are tossing that out. And that problem, I think, has only become more and more an issue as the United States gets more polarized. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think polarization is probably one of the worst things that happens, because obviously it's not just in your faith life. It's not just within your faith community. It takes place in your community around you. It takes place in your family, in your workplace, between friends. The division and polarization grows, and it causes more pain than necessary, especially when you can't have tough conversations.
We definitely make it a lot harder than it has to be for people that want to belong in the Catholic Church. And one thing that I recommend to folks is that they try and understand, what camps is it that you're trying to fit into? Are you a member of this political party because that's what you're expected to do in your community? Or is it because you truly hold these principles? Now, it's complicated. I rarely find that motivations are pure. I think they're layered. And certainly a layer to any of our views, whether it's religious or political, it's going to be about wanting to socialize, wanting to belong. It's just so innate to the nature of being a person. And so when I'm talking with somebody about what is truth, obviously Aquinas would say truth is the evidence that cannot be refuted. Right? That's absolutely true. He's talking about objective reality there. But when folks talk to me about, whether or not we're preaching and understanding the truth, sometimes what they're actually asking is, are you being honest? Have you ever thought about whether or not there's like a difference between truth and honesty?
I actually think they go hand in hand, right? If you are being truthful, then in your intent, you're being honest. If you're being honest, people are going to trust your honesty. I do think they go hand in hand in that sense, but I also feel like there's people who know that and will act in bad faith using either their honesty or their trustworthiness to increase that polarization. So it becomes the fine dance of, do I trust this person? Do I know them to be honest? Can I believe what they're saying? Or do I not know this person? How can I trust them? How in the world am I supposed to take anything they're saying seriously and cause more division?
This is actually something that Jesus addressed very directly. He was a faithful Jew. I really do not think that can be, that idea can be thrown away. It is innate to his identity. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus actually doubles down. I did not come to abolish the law. He is doubling down on it. But he did kind of make this claim that we need to be truthful and honest at the same time. Because in John 14, when Jesus is proclaimed as the way, the truth, and the life, it's actually a very particular term in Greek, aletheia. I don't know if you've heard that before, aletheia, but it's essentially the unhiding, the unveiling. And so, of course, Jesus Christ himself is the truth. We believe that. But he is the unveiling of God so that our human eyes can see, can touch, can understand. And now in the Eucharist, we can eat, receive, and be transformed to be more like him. And so when somebody talks to me about their experiences in church, whether they were told to hide something about themselves, or perhaps because of pressures that they felt they didn't want to let their parish community know that they're divorced, or perhaps they're hungry and not able to afford groceries, or perhaps the marriage is not going well, or they're fighting with a family member or a friend. These are things that are happening every single day in our congregations. And because of that pressure, that desire to want to appear like a Catholic that has our act totally together, a lot of us hide this down. But that is antithetical to the Eucharist itself, which is the unveiling.
So I'm glad you said that, because I want to speak as a convert here real quick. That's something I actually picked up on very quickly once I was received into the church and I started to go to Mass as a full-fledged member of the church as a practicing Catholic. I went to my local parish, and one of the things I quickly noticed in my time going to that parish, I don't go to that parish anymore, but when I was, still in college, going to this parish, you could see that division. It was very evident. You had the people that were in that Catholic bubble that were doing what they thought they needed to do to present themselves as good practicing Catholics. And they all tend to sit in one section of the church, usually in the first 5 pews, very close to the altar, because they wanted to give that holiness perception. Then you had, the families or the families that may be going through something, or people who may be going through something that's public, right? Maybe it's, they know Bob and Susan are going through a rough patch in their marriage. they've kind of removed themselves and they're sitting off to the side now. They're sitting off into the side or in the back. Or maybe you are a gay Catholic and people know, maybe you don't feel comfortable sitting up front or in the middle. You're kind of sitting towards the back, also close to the exit, because you feel like there's an escape route, right? It was very obvious the groups, the small groups within that parish and where they are and what exactly was going on based upon where you sat. And as a convert, I was actually quite shocked to realize, I mean, again, I had the CCM bubble in college where everyone was a part of a community and no one really cared because we're all striving for the same thing. But like you were saying, in the real world, that message kind of gets distorted a little bit. And it's almost like you're back in high school with all the different cliques, right? You have to be part of the cool kids to sit in these pews. If you're part of the rejects or the drama nerds, you're in this other pew. So I think you're spot on there that we have these different subgroups based upon where we are in our own faith journey and what struggles we're going through within the church. And it's very noticeable. And that's one of the things that we've talked about before was, if we have this idea that the Catholic Church is universal and we're here for everyone, then we need to be a whole community and not a segregated and divided community.
Exactly. The theologian I was drawing on from earlier, Maurizio Chiodi, he says that we have to recognize that universality is necessary for moral knowledge. So I got to say, when I see someone who is being, I don't know if you want to say pious, but clearly outwardly looks very traditional, I actually see a bit of myself and I appreciate it and I love it. And I very rarely suspect that someone is being fake. There are many folks that I have worked with over the years where I found out that there's kind of this balancing act where Catholics who maybe feel like there's one part of their life that is very difficult and they're carrying a very heavy burden, and their way of offering that up are these pious acts or going to the Latin Mass. I do agree that a lot of the folks that go to the traditional Latin Mass are in many ways trying much harder than your average Catholic. However, it's layered. Everyone in the congregation at some point in their life is feeling that sense of exclusion. In order to really understand the truth, the unveiling of Jesus Christ, we have to know that, okay, if we've got this group that's sitting in the front, we've got this group that's hiding in the back. If we have this group, and please take note, this is the thing, individuals that leave Mass immediately after communion, not because they want to get to Burger King, although that was me when I was 8 years old, not because they want to get home early, but because they are afraid to talk to the parishioners afterwards. So we do not want to judge folks that leave Mass a little bit early. I was at a parish recently. I saw a sign that said the only person that left Mass early was Judas. No, that is not acceptable, because perhaps Judas is sitting with us still at Mass.
I remember seeing that same sign. I unfortunately had to excuse myself to use the washroom, and it was like in the middle of a homily. And sure enough, there was that sign in the vestibule of the church. And I saw that and I felt so guilty after reading that. I walked back in and I suffered for the last 30 minutes instead of going to the washroom. But I mean, that sign's got some power there. I'm like, that's the Catholic guilt trip almost.
Sometimes we tend to build fear into our equations, into the signs. There was a sign at a parish in 2020. It said, "No mask Nazis," which has absolutely nothing to do with theology or the Mass or belonging in church. But it was actually the parish that my parents had gone to. And none of us were really into wearing masks. Nobody liked it, right? A lot of us put up with it. However, it made even those who were willingly wearing a mask feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that was done perhaps to satisfy the political urges or desires of a very particular subset. So, all that to say that in order to understand the universality of the church, in order to understand morality, we have to know the concrete experiences of the people all around us in the church. And that's going to take a lot of time and discomfort for us to get used to.
I think one of the biggest things that we can really take away from this, right, is the idea that, number one, right, when you take a look at Catholic churches throughout the country, attendance is down. So the people who are going to Mass are the ones that are holding on to their faith, are the ones that want to practice their faith, or the ones that want to get better. Or maybe they're, someone who's rediscovering their faith or discovering the Catholic Church. Maybe it's someone who's looking to convert, right? At the end of the day, the issue is we don't know for sure the stories of everyone else in those pews next to us. We're all there for the same reason. We're there to worship our loving God, to hear his message, to hear the lesson that he has for our lives, for where we are, and what we can take from that message and live in our everyday life outside of the church. That's one of the things the priest says is go and spread the good news, go and spread the gospel of the Lord. We're called to leave Mass and take what we've learned and what's spoken to us in that time period and instill it in our lives to be that light in our community. So when I go to Mass, I'm not really paying attention to what anybody else is doing. I'm there focusing on myself, the message God has for me. I'm focused on how I can take that message and live it out better in my life with those who are there with me in Mass and in my community. It's a team effort, if you will. But at the end of the day, right, it's we're all at our own unique points in our faith journey. And I think that's the most important thing to remember is that when we're in Mass, we should not be worrying about who's sitting where. We shouldn't be worrying about who's sitting next to who. We should be worried about bettering ourselves and following Christ to the best of our ability through receiving the sacraments and living out what Christ has called us to live out as his followers. And I think that's the big important thing, is to ensure that we're doing that.
It's impossible not to acknowledge that some folks have already felt kicked out, and so they're not going to return. And so in that sense, I actually would say we should be paying attention to where people are sitting at Mass and making sure that somebody is there to accompany them, to at least go up and say, hey, I don't think I've seen you here at the parish before. Can I offer you a coffee after Mass? Do you have any questions about the church? Is there anything we can do to help serve you? Or is there any way that you would like to be involved? And I think oftentimes people are very excited to tell their story. Doing that at church is a version of the Emmaus walk in itself. Now, have you ever thought about how the experience of feeling kicked out can be found directly in the Bible itself?
No, I haven't really thought about that, but I do know what it feels like to feel like you've been kicked out.
You do. Are you sharing that today, or is that a future episode?
No, I mean, there's times where you feel that maybe you're not good enough. Maybe, you are paying attention to the people around you and you're seeing how holy they are, how pious they are, or, maybe their prayer life is somewhere where you wish yours could be. Or maybe, that little voice in your head starts talking to you like, I've never seen them in the line for confession, but yet I've gone 3 times in the past 2.5 weeks, kind of thing, right? That little voice gets in the back of your head a little bit. And you can kind of ostracize yourself in that sense by kind of listening to that voice in your head that's giving you those doubts.
One of the ways that we admittedly do that is we have a uniform posture. Now, every culture does it differently, but here in the United States, we have, what do they call it? The Catholic kinesiology, where you
aerobics.
Stand up. Aerobics. Okay.
Aerobics, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that uniformity is both very important for the liturgical functions because it helps us understand how we are praying with our bodies, but it can also make a lot of people a little bit anxious about going into the church. Maybe you haven't been since 2011 and you would just want to say, and also with you. But the reality is that we need to make a space where everyone can feel welcome at the church. There should not be an expectation that you have to be a perfectly rehabilitated Catholic before you come to Mass. And figuring out how to configure our parishes so that we are truly missionary bodies in the cities that we reside, it's going to take some time. I do want to tell a quick story of a man that started coming to Mass earlier this year. He's homeless. And of course, when he walked into church, you could see he would sit down and the parishioners would grab their bags and go, pull them right next to them. And then you would see a few parishioners get up and walk away. Either were complaining that he might steal their stuff or he smelled of, I don't know, we'll say the aroma of the streets. But there was this preconceived idea that this man who just sat down, perhaps because we've met many other homeless people before and we know how this movie ends, they had a hard time understanding that maybe he was here because he wants to receive Christ, because he wants to participate in Mass. Well, he had some courage. He stayed at Mass probably 4 or 5 Sundays in a row, fully participating, never causing a problem, always being polite. And I remember the first few weeks, people were like, hey, that troublemaker's hanging around. And I would just say, oh, yeah, really? Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know, as if I'm supposed to go save them from this man. But after about 5 weeks of attending Mass and participating and knowing the words, my fellow parishioners, we came to trust him. Not only that, I started to see people going up to him on Sundays to ask how he was doing and what are you up to? And oh, by the way, I have a story I want to tell you. Again, this is another version of the Emmaus story playing out, where in order to understand how Jesus is working in somebody's life, we have to be open to being surprised, and we have to have a two-way exchange of stories. And that is very, very important. You're going to hear that theme over and over again as we go through the next many podcast episodes.
Well, one thing I want to point out here real quick, Dan, is you mentioned how your parish really embraced this homeless man because he wanted to come to Mass. He was there for the right reasons, and your parish fully embraced him. But the point of being Catholic is teaching truth, is learning truth. How do we do that to the population that may be struggling with truth or maybe not living by the church's rules for us?
I think it's fair to say that even as we're welcoming people, that we can't lose sight of the main mission, which is teaching truth and preaching salvation. That is core to our Catholic mission. I guess I would point out that as we're welcoming folks in, there are different metaphors, different images that we could use to describe what it means to seek the truth. So, for example, my parish had a Brazilian priest for several years. And when he would talk about truth, I would take note and say, okay, I've got a certain image in my mind. It's almost like I'm living in a dark room and the priest is holding a candle. And the truth is that light. That actually kind of goes back to the earlier metaphor we were using when we were talking about Jesus as the unveiling, right? So if we think of the Eucharist as an unveiling, the sacrament, Jesus Christ that we encounter in the sacrament, that is the light in the dark room. However, I contrast that with some of the other perspectives that I heard, particularly from English-speaking congregations. It sounds sometimes like we're talking about truth like it's a football, and we just got to like run it down the field for a touchdown. And you know, that fits in more with the motif of a polarized society that's trying to build tribes, right? That's inherently an image of teams, and you're either on team truth or team lie. That doesn't work. Jesus Christ is the light in a dark room. Now, what happens when you're walking through a dark room and don't have a light?
You bump into the walls and you trip over stuff.
Exactly. Now, the walls, I would say that's the reality that we're living in. I like to say theology is reality, right? If God is the greatest sum, if he is all of reality, then we're just lucky enough to be living in it. And so I would say theology in itself is kind of a lived experience. And so thinking of reality as a room and it's dark because our eyes are not able to see, that's a really good motif for the Eucharist. And of course, Jesus Christ himself is the light. It doesn't work quite as well if we are living in a hyper-competitive mindset and we're starting to think of the truth as a football or it's a sporting event. Although it's tempting, it sounds more fun in some ways because I like winning. But that's going to be the attitude the misunderstanding of truth that leads us to not allow people the freedom to try out Mass. So I guess I'd say that truth and freedom, super connected, and it's a two-way street. It doesn't just give us the freedom to move about the cabin with the knowledge that we have the light and we can see where we're going. It's also this freedom that allows people the opportunity to try out Mass, try out the Catholic Church without fear of rejection. What do you think about that?
I like that analogy a lot.
Cardinal Casper, he was in Pope Benedict's administration, so he's a fairly conservative, traditionally minded guy, and his expertise was working with ecumenical dialogue, so non-Catholic groups. And I actually thought that he had a really good quote about 10 years ago, because in his world, he's talking about individuals that they're not fully part of the truth because they're part of different religions. I'm not fully explaining his position well, but that's essentially it. He's talking to other faiths. You and I are here talking about people who may already be Catholic, but they have not been a full member of our community for one reason or another. And I think Cardinal Casper really hit it when he said, the truth is always bigger than our formulas. More controversially, he said, none of us has the truth. The truth has us. And so he's setting us up for that Emmaus walk with Jesus, because in order to understand the truth, you have to have an exchange of dialogue. And so that's really the point that we're trying to make here. We're seeking truth. We're preaching truth. We believe that Jesus Christ himself is the light that gives us the freedom to move around the room and not bump into things. But we need to bring people with us. And we do not necessarily have to demand that they fully understand things the way that we do. That's actually a form of relativism in itself. If you're like, my experiences, my observations, my specific feelings and political beliefs, they're correct and yours don't matter. That's another form of relativism. We got to avoid that, because the truth can be found through this exchange, and we got to do it together in the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Okay, I think that was a great first episode. Listen, this is a sample of what you can expect over the coming episodes. We're going to dive deep into issues that impact millions of Catholics around the world. We're going to try and understand situations that you may be facing, how to understand vice and virtue, how to reframe the question about going to confession, which is a terrifying experience for so many, but also a healing experience. So we're going to seek to help everyone balance that out. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe so you can catch all of our episodes, and follow us on social media, on X at Theo Unwanted and Instagram at Theo Unwanted. The Theology for the Unwanted Podcast is a project that's come from having met with more than 200 Catholics over the past 5 years that are struggling to stay. And it's also born from my personal experiences. So I'm really grateful to be starting this podcast with you, John. I really hope that if you're struggling with the faith or on the verge of leaving, I really hope that the content here is helpful, that today is the moment that you start feeling like you're not a second-class citizen. Our dignity stems from our creation in God's image, and finding true freedom in that knowledge is a journey. Let's keep exploring Catholic theology together. Until next time.